The Strong went down like a stone. Her depth charges began to explode, and some of the men still aboard struggled in the water. After she was gone, other destroyers picked up more survivors, and some swam to the beach, but 46 men were lost at 1 o'clock in the morning. The American bombardment group had finished its job, and all the surviving ships headed out for Guadalcanal. The transport group stayed on to unload, and the destroyers moved to a point about 1,500 yards off the Rice anchorage and began to disembark men and equipment into Higgins boats and rubber boats. Each Higgins boat towed one 10-man rubber boat into shore. The Japanese batteries at Inagi Point then shifted their fire to the transport destroyers, and 150 projectiles began falling around the landing area. The destroyers Gwyn and Radford took the Japanese batteries on Columbangara under fire and silenced 2 of them. The other 2 guns continued to fire during the landings but did not score any hits. The landing was completed by 6 o'clock, and the transport group retired on the way out of the strait. The Ralph Talbot S. Lookout spotted an American whaleboat and pulled up alongside to rescue 18 more survivors from the Strong. Then the Ralph Talbot caught up with the other ships, and they all retired to Guadalcanal without further excitement. On the morning of July 5th, the Japanese High Command at Rabaul recognized the significance of the previous night's maneuvering. The appearance of that Allied landing unit in Kola Gulf had to mean that the enemy was preparing to assault Munda Airfield at 7 o'clock on the morning of July 5th. Rabaul headquarters had word from the Navy Special Landing Force troops Marines that the Allied forces were moving. Overland, Colonel Livard had with him the 1st Marine Raider Regimental Headquarters, the 1st Marine Raider Battalion, and the 3rd Battalion of the Army 145th Infantry, and the 3rd Battalion of the Army 148th Infantry, leaving 2 companies of the 145th and some quartermaster personnel at Rice Anchorage to handle beach defence and resupply Lee Edge, took the remainder of the force, marching toward what they called Dragon's Peninsula Company D of the 1st Raider Battalion, was sent ahead to secure a bridgehead across the Giza River. On July 5th, Admiral Akiyama was back at his task, moving south to reinforce Columbangara and New Georgia with the Army troops assigned by General Imamura shortly after sundown. 3 different groups of destroyers left the advance base at Buen to head for the American in Elegance was working well this day, and in the middle of the afternoon Admiral Holly had the word that a large number of Japanese destroyers at Rabaul were loading and getting up steam to go someplace. It did not take Holly long to figure out where. He informed Admiral Ainsworth's cruiser force, which was in Indispensable straight off the southern tip of Guadalcanal. Ainsworth turned around and started back up the slot. There was no time to fuel, but luckily he did not need fuel at the moment. Ainsworth had with him 3 cruisers. The Honolulu Helena and St. Louis, his destroyer force, had also been brought back to strength after the loss of the Strong by the assignment of the Radford and Jenkins, which were just then loading fuel at Tulagi after their strenuous night-off Rice landing. They hurried and caught up with the cruiser task group shortly after dark, the Japanese. Captains had been complaining that the suddenness with which these resupply operations were launched and the orders changed created a lot of confusion. The Americans could have said the same. The 2 new destroyer captains were not familiar with the task group commander's orders. It was another rump group that was expected to perform like a trained squadron, but there was no help for it. Events were moving too fast in the Central Solomons to go by the book. Admiral Ainsworth was confident, so was Admiral Akiyama, but the Americans had 2 distinct advantages. First, they were sending cruisers with their 6-in guns, which could stand off at long range and blast the enemy destroyers without taking gunfire in return. And second, all the American ships in this group were equipped with radar. Admiral Akiyama was confident because just the night before he had sunk an American ship in that brief engagement of Columbangara. Also, he had no great respect for the American ability to fight at night. The weather had continued to be foul, and this hampered the American search planes during the day. And that night the Americans sent out radar-equipped night fighters on search missions, but they did not find Admiral Akiyama's force. Furthermore, even though the Japanese had made exceedingly good use of their long-lance torpedoes in virtually every destroyer encounter since the beginning of the Guadalcanal campaign, the American naval authorities still had not come to understand the nature of the Japanese weapon. The torpedo was oxygen-driven. It had a range of 22,000 yard 12+ mil at 49.9 knots, or 44,000 yard 25M at 36 knots, and it was about twice as powerful as the American torpedo. The sinking of the Strong the night before ought to have been an object lesson. It would have been virtually impossible for an American destroyer to have duplicated this feat, but the scurrying and confusion of the times let such lessons go unstudied. Admiral Anworth was secure in the knowledge that his 6-in guns outgunned the 4.6-in guns of the enemy. Admiral Akiyama was secure in the knowledge that his torpedoes outgunned the 6-in guns just after midnight, which made the date July 6th. Admiral Akiyama detached the destroyers Mizuki Mikazuki and Hamikaze to hug the coast of Kolombangara and head for V. He took his other 7 destroyers down the middle of Koa Gulf. Thus, if there were any enemy ships about, he would be likely to meet them, while Captain Suo Orita with the small force got about the business of landing his troops and supplies at Villa as the Japanese group began to split. The blips showed up on the radar screen of Admiral Ainsworth's flagship, the Honolulu. The Japanese were about 16 mil away from the American task group. Admiral Anworth ordered the ships into battle formation, the destroyers Nicholas and O'Bannon leading the 3 cruisers in line, followed by the other 2 destroyers. The Jenkins and Radford Akiyamas changing in disposition puzzled the Americans. What were those 3 Japanese destroyers doing, turning off to the right? Besides, at this range, the high mountains of Kolombangara tended to foul the radar screens, and Admiral Ainsworth was not quite sure how many or what sort of ships he faced. He came to the conclusion that there were at least 7 enemy vessels, perhaps 9, and he still did not know what class ships they were when the range had closed to 6 miles admiral. Ainsworth decided to open fire using his radar for fire control. He chose the second group of ships in the Aki force, and these were the Amigiri Hatsuyuki Nagatsuki, and Satsuki the cruisers would attack these ships, and so would 2 of the American destroyers. The other 2 American destroyers would fire on the leading Japanese ships, which were directly under Admiral Akiyama's control. They were his flagship the Nuki, the Suzuki, and the Taniki. But 5 minutes after the American ships had changed to battle formation, Admiral Akiyama's new radar set aboard the flagship picked up the enemy vessels. He ordered the Japanese ships to speed up to 30 knots and prepare to launch torpedoes at 3 minutes before 2 o'clock. The Americans began firing. The first shells from the cruisers were aimed by radar at the Nzuki, and they struck home, knocking out her steering and dealing her IM mortal wound. She began taking water immediately. But the Susukaze and Taniki launched 16 torpedoes that headed for the American force. The cruisers continued to fire at a high rate of speed, and the enormous racket and lighting up of the sky convinced Admiral Ainsworth that he had the enemy on the run. He was sure he was obliterating the Japanese ships, but the fact was that he was doing nothing of the kind. The Suzuki-Kaze was hit by several 6-in shells, and some fires started, and 3 men were killed, but the most serious damage was the loss of her searchlight, for the Japanese dearly loved to confuse the enemy by lighting them up. The Tanasi was hit only by a dud 6-in shell in the forecastle, and it spoiled a number of bags of rice that was all having made their torpedo attack. The 2 Japanese destroyers turned, made smoke, and ran out of the battle zone to reload torpedo tubes the American destroyer skippers charged with attacking the lead ships wanted to fire torpedoes. But Admiral Ainsworth told them to use guns first, so they withheld the torpedoes. They lost their slim chance to once more show their proficiency with these weapons. But this time it was not their fault. They were at the orders of a big ship admiral. The difference between the Japanese and the American tactics soon became painfully apparent 7 minutes after the Japanese ships had fired a spread of 16 torpedoes. They began to arrive in the American area within 3 minutes. The cruiser Helena was hit by 3 torpedoes. Her bow was blown off and her back broken. She folded up like a jackknife. Admiral Anworth did not even know what had happened until a few minutes later. When the Helena failed to answer signals, the signals called her to join an attack on the other 4 Japanese destroyers loaded with troops and supplies for Villa, which were 8 mil away and going along at 30 knots. Admiral Ainsworth then made a move that should have won the battle. He crossed the enemy, for now the Japanese ships were moving in a column against the American column at a 90 degrees angle. That meant all the American ships could fire on all the Japanese destroyers, but only the first destroyer in the Japanese line could fire at the Americans. But for some reason the American shells failed to hurt the Amagiri first in line, and she pulled out of the deadly formation. The Hatsuyuki was second in line. She was hit by 3 shells, and all of them were duds. So the damage they caused was not fatal. Only 5 men were killed. The worst problem was the destruction of the bridge. Attack and left the scene of the Helena sinking for Guadalcanal and safety. 4 boats stayed behind to continue rescue. The Japanese planes came, and so did the American planes when they got to the scene of the battle. All they saw were the whaleboats moving around in the oily waters above the Helena and the Nagatsuki, hard aground on her reef off the Kolum Bangara coast. The Japanese were heavily outnumbered, 39 American planes to their S-0s, but they tried to protect the Nagatsuki. They fought hard. The odds were great, but in a way they succeeded, because while the Americans claimed to have shot down 4 of the Zeros, they did not manage to destroy the Nagatsuki. That accomplishment was left to a flight of B-25 medium bombers, which arrived in the afternoon, when no Japanese air cover was present. The B-25S bombed very effectively, setting the ship afire in several places. That evening her magazines went up, and the Nagatsuki was a wreck. The remains of the crew who had stood off the morning attack with their anti-aircraft weapons left the ship and went ashore to join their fellows on the overland trip through the jungle of Kolum Bangara to V. So the battle the Americans called the Battle of Kula Gulf came to an end. The Americans claimed a victory, misreading great plumes of smoke for ships that were burning. The Japanese said only that the results of the battle were indeterminate. The battle was reminiscent of another, the Battle of Tassafaronga, in the last days of the Japanese tenure on Guadalcanal. Rear Admiral Rizo Tanaka was roasted by Admiral Yamamoto after scoring a brilliant victory at the Battle of Tassafaronga, sinking an American cruiser and damaging 3 others without losing a destroyer. Yamamoto was furious then, because Tanaka failed to carry out his assigned mission, which was to resupply the troops ashore in Admiral Akiyama's case, while his forces had lost an admiral and 2 destroyers and suffered damage to others. They had sunk an American cruiser, carried out the mission faultlessly, and landed 1,600 reinforcements, so by the hard standards of the Japanese High Command, the late Admiral Akiyama had to be given credit for victory at Kua Gulf. The Japanese naval and army commands at Rabaul had been taken completely by surprise by the Renova landings. The main reason for the surprise was the speed with which the Americans were able to act. The Japanese simply had underestimated the enemy, and for a time longer continued to do so. The failure was largely that of the army. The Japanese Navy had been taught by Admiral Yamamoto to respect American productivity, and the Battle of Midway had erased any doubts in the minds of his adherers. They were still the men in control of the combined fleet, but just now, in the early period of the cooperative operations by Army and Navy in the South Pacific, they were not prepared for the sort of land action that the Americans were ready to undertake, nor would it have made any difference because the Army did not take advice from the Navy the size of the Japanese garrison on Renova. Just about 300 men in total was an indication of the degree of the surprise. From some of the captured diaries of Japanese soldiers and sailors came glimpses of the views of the men in the field. They wondered privately why they were not reinforced. The main reason was that Army and Navy could not decide what was to be done. By whom the Army's position had always been that the Navy was responsible for defence of these little islands, where large-scale military tactics were of no use at all, despite the new orders from Imperial General Headquarters. The old ways died hard, and so, as of the end of June, the Japanese still had done virtually nothing to reinforce the Central Solomons, although they had plenty of warning from the airmen who came back day after day to report new installations going up in the Buells and on Guadalcanal. Thus, the landings on New Georgia caught the Japanese with but a single regiment to protect the entire island, and of course General Sasaki chose to concentrate most of this force at the northern end of the island in the Munda airfield perimeter, because, as everyone knew this was the vital point of the island and the key to defence of the Central Solomons with the landings at Renova. General Sasaki warned Rabul that the enemy would move swiftly against New Georgia and asked for reinforcements. They had been coming but more slowly than he would like, and because of the nature of the ports on Colum Bangara and New Georgia, most of the troops were brought first to the V base on Colum Bangara. That island possessed 3 piers capable of handling seagoing vessels. Vas was by far the best and the only one capable of taking a destroyer. New Georgia had 2 piers, only one of them truly useful for supply, and that at Barocco Bay, thus Colonel Liver's mission to capture that area was extremely important to the success of the Allied cause. Colonel Liver's jungle fighters Marine and Army were called the Northern Landing Group to differentiate them from General Hester's troops, who had crossed to New Georgia via the narrow strait from Renova and were making their way laboriously across country. The Northern Landing Group had bivouacked on the bank of the Giza River on the night of July 5th, and early the next morning they crossed the river and began moving toward the Tamako River, their next natural obstacle. Both crossings were difficult, because the constant rain of the past 2 weeks had made torrents of streams that in other times of the year were down to the creek level. The land was mostly swamp, and where there was hard ground, it was no longer hard, but sticky mud. The 3rd Battalion of the 148th Infantry was diverted to move toward the Mundaboko Trail, and there to set up a trail block that barrier should keep the Japanese from bringing any reinforcements or supplies overland to the airfield at Munda from V the main body, then continued along the trail to Enog Inlet. At this inlet, Colonel Livard expected to meet the Japanese already. A bombing raid on the Japanese G. Gieson at the inlet had been staged from Guadalcanal to support the overland operation just about 8 mil away as the crow flies. But 8 miles of rugged mountain territory covered with thick jungle General Hester's troops were not doing very well. They had the advantage of the heavy artillery back on Renova, but in the jungle this was not as much help as it might have been elsewhere. The Japanese defenders, well-trained troops of the 229th Regiment, had dug in along the Eshesh River not far from Zanana. The Japanese watched the movement of the Americans for several days, beginning on July 2nd, and estimated that they had brought 11,000 troops to the island, but the Americans did not launch the attack that was expected. Instead, they too dug in along the Showa River, closer to the mouth. The Japanese plan called for attack on July 7th. At that point, the American 172nd Regiment combat team was on the left, and the 169th Infantry Regiment was on the right, as the Americans moved toward the Barocco River. The Japanese gave ground slowly. They made excellent use of the jungle, and seemed to have snipers everywhere actually. This whole defence against General Hester's large force was carried out by the 11th Battalion of the 229th Infantry Regiment. Less than 1,000 men. In the evenings they infiltrated the American lines and carried out what they called Shinta Giorano, literally infiltration commotion action, according to the official Japanese war history. The operations here were extremely successful, far more than they had been against the Marines on Guadalcanal. The Japanese troops crawled through the jungle like crabs, making rustling noises in the jungle. They made animal noises and gave bird calls to unnerve the Americans. They attacked foxholes, screaming like idiots, and once inside the American perimeter they rushed about stabbing and strangling the soldiers in their foxholes. Until cut down, they used many flares to signal each other not only for informational purposes, but for the psychological effect they had on the enemy by July 8th. They felt that they had succeeded and that the Americans were extremely edgy and their morale damaged badly enough to affect their fighting capability. How right they were. The Americans got virtually no sleep for 3 nights in a row. They fired at everything that moved in the darkness, and they killed and wounded some of their own men. The Japanese record from the after-action reports of the 229th Infantry Regiment was extremely laconic, but also revealing, as shown by the following sample: July 6th enemy contact maintained, and on July 7th at about 8:30 a.m., the enemy commenced an advance, having been reinforced. The Japanese battalion held the trail on the right bank against the enemy. We held our own on July 8th. The enemy brought in still more troops. Mountain artillery fire fell close by our No. 1 trail, and a fierce fight developed. General Hester's advance was badly bogged down, and in 4 days his 169th Regiment had moved only a mile and a half inland along the trail to Munda. He did not seem to be able to make up his mind about what to do with the 172nd Regimental Combat Team, so it was stalled at Zanana. Finally, the general tried to move the men of the 17th along the coast to Liana. The Japanese soon had them pinned down too. Japanese jungle tactics had little effect on Colonel Liver's northern assault force, largely because the raiders had been trained to fight under just such circumstances. On July 7th, the main force moved toward Maranoa Thund and got there without meeting any resistance 20 minutes later. However, the advance unit moving out toward Tree ran into a Japanese patrol and killed 2 of the enemy. These were identified as naval troops, Japanese Marines, members of the Kure 5th Special Landing Force. These were the troops who served the Barrow port, and they were fighting along with the Japanese army, but under entirely separate command and orders. Although Tokyo True and Rabul had all ordered cooperation, it just did not get down to the regimental level. All was quiet for a time, but at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, firing began again, and it was apparent that the Japanese were launching an attack when it ended. 10 Japanese were dead, including 1 officer, and the Marines had 1 prisoner badly wounded in that action. The Americans lost 3 men killed and 4 men were wounded. The most valuable adjunct to the action was the discovery that the officer had a map of the Japanese defense positions at Enog and Barocco. During the daylight hours, the Guadalcanal Air Force was giving the troops all the support it could, but most of the bombers and fighters went to General Hester's area where the Americans were in trouble. General Sasaki had every right to be pleased with the way his small force in the Zanana area was holding the Americans. He was, in fact, impatient to be in action on a much larger scale. To his knowledge, day after day the enemy was bringing troops and armaments to Rendova, which meant the enemy's strength was being multiplied several times. Sasaki was expecting new orders from Rabal, but he did not get them from Rabol. He did not even get any information as to a plan to drive the Americans out of the Central Solomons, although that was the reason for which General Sasaki was brought down to New Georgia in the first place. At the moment, the Americans were not giving him a great deal of trouble. General Hester's force had proved so inept as not to require anything like his maximum effort. But he could not expect that situation to continue indefinitely. He had to expect another landing closer to Munda and an all-out attack on, if he did nothing to stop it. And at the moment he did not have the resources to launch a counter-attack that night of July 7. He considered the problem and asked Rabul for orders, while General Sasaki waited for an answer. The minor actions continued. They were little more than skirmishes by his standards. On July 8th, the Japanese sent a company against the Americans at Tree, and that morning the Marines and Army troops fought 2 sharp actions at 11. The Japanese withdrew toward Boko, and the 1st Raider Battalion continued to move toward Inagi along the west shore of the Inagi Inlet. Tri became the base of operations. The 145th Infantry's detachment established headquarters here, and Major Girardo of the Medical Corps set up his aid station here too, by mid-afternoon on July 8th. It became apparent that Colonel Livard had made a bad guess about the terrain along the Inoi Inlet. The Japanese had no intention of letting the Americans set up shop at Tree at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. They attacked again, and this time the fighting was harder than ever. Only when a company of the 1st Raiders came up and hit the Japanese on the left flank was the issue resolved. They were the advanced unit of the force that had gone toward Inagi. The 1st Raiders came back, announcing that they had reached absolutely impossible territory. It was all deep swamp. They started out again, but this time moving uphill along drier ground to the west. The Japanese then moved back toward Boko, leaving many dead in the field. If General Sasaki needed a nudge, the results of the day's fighting gave it. The American pressure was increasing, and the hour of decision was coming near. Something had to be done. That afternoon, Sasaki composed a message for East Area Army Headquarters at Rabal, giving a digest of the current military situation and an explanation of his views at 2:57 a.m. Major knew the plan was for the 13th Infantry to assemble in the plantation area about 5 miles from Munda, and from this point on July 11th to stage a major attack on General Hester's troops. Those American troops in southern New Georgia were confused, and so badly beleaguered by July 8th that Admiral Turner ordered up a dawn bombardment from the guns that lined the shores of One-Vizzy Island just 3 mil away, and at the same time he sent a 60-plane bombing raid against Munda, as well as 4 destroyers to bombard the airfield area in an hour. The 155 howitzers on Onvisi poured 5,800 rounds into the jungle. Where the Japanese were supposed to be, the destroyers used 2 35-inch shells against the airfields, and the bombers dropped 70 tons of bombs. The result reported to Rabaul by General Sasaki was 9 men killed and 10 men wounded back at Tri. Colonel Livard was not happy. The campaign was not going well, and he needed some help that he could not ask for, and his only operative radio had been crushed by a falling tree at Guadalcanal on the night of July 9th. Admiral Turner's staff figured out that there was something wrong when the hours went by and they had no word from Liversedge. They knew Livard must be short of supplies. They moved to help, and on the morning of July J10 came a welcome airdrop. It consisted of K rations, chocolate and ammunition. As soon as the bundles were picked up and opened, Livard rushed a detachment up toward Inagi to supply his forward troops. That morning those hungry Marines had tightened their belts and started the attack again. At 7 o'clock they fought like hungry tigers, and by 3 o'clock in the afternoon the Japanese were driven from Inagi, and the rice warehouse belonged to the Marines. At last they could eat, but not rice. And just then Captain Morrow of the 145th Infantry came hurrying up with a detachment loaded down with rations and ammunition. The raiders passed out the latter and dug into the former they had been without food or water for 30 hours. Raider Captain Clay Boyd then led his D Company in a push through to Inagi Point, and as darkness came the raiders set up a defence perimeter. 2 small pockets of Japanese were contained within the general perimeter they would be dealt with the next morning, but already they had possession of the position, and the Japanese heavy artillery batteries, Major Kika's battalion of the 13th Regiment, marched all morning on July 10th, heading from Barocco down toward Munda, along the narrow twisting trail. The Major was a careful officer. The main body was preceded by a point group, and on each side flankers made sure that they would not be ambushed by the enemy at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. However they hit the roadblock in China, these Japanese troops had learned the psychological value of noise. They began whooping and shouting Banzai threats and obscenities at the Americans. The Japanese harried the tired and bewildered army troops all afternoon, but they could not remain forever in a static position. Colonel Tominari was behind them with the other battalions of the 13th Regiment, and they had to clear the way. That meant driving through the American line. All went well until they encountered a small stream that was not on the map, and there they had trouble, but they had to break through. And after heavy fighting they did with 100 casualties. They were then led down toward W. Munda by a patrol under Lieutenant Furak Kawa, who had been sent out by General Sasaki's command, and had fought his way through the enemy lines. The 3rd Battalion continued south in contact with the enemy much of the time, punishing the enemy and moving them out of the way so that Colonel Tamari's troops would not be hit by them. They arrived in the plantation area at about 5:30 on the afternoon of July 12th and set up camp. They were met there by a staff officer from General Sasaki's command, and he gave them their orders. The Japanese bedded down in the recently fortified area of the Lambe plantation. Others had arrived earlier, and others would be coming in constantly for the next week or 2. It appeared that they were going into battle almost immediately, but the men were tired from their long trip and half-day battle. They needed a break before going up into the line to join the troops of the 229th Regiment outside Zanana on the afternoon of July 12th. A young lieutenant from the Imperial Army, 229th Regiment, showed up at the camp with tears in his eyes, bearing a plea from Colonel Genjiro Harada for reinforcement of several positions, particularly those where the Liversedge column was operating. He had a sad story to tell of Japanese troops being overwhelmed by the enemy. He asked for help to go with him right away. Several young officers encouraged the lieutenant. They grew very excited and talked of annihilating the Americans. They came up to the command post and said they were ready to move out to start the attack immediately. But the camp commander intervened. The troops were exhausted. He announced, much as he would like to help, he could not send these men into battle. This day they had been marching for 2 and 3 days. They had suffered through nerve-wracking crossings from Colon Bangara, and they had fought their way down to the plantation from Barocco. They would soon enough be annihilating the enemy in the major attack in the south, and they must have at least a little rest. The young lieutenant from the 229th Regiment was so distraught that he undertook to argue with his superiors. Usually such action would mean immediate discipline, even to the point of death, but in this case the senior officers were sympathetic. The young lieutenant had obviously been through much. His uniform was stained and torn, and he had none of his equipment except his pistol and his samurai sword. But on the matter of rushing off to save a detachment of the 229th, the senior officers were adamant the men could not go, not yet, and the lieutenant took one last despairing look around, and then he slipped away through the cocoa palms of the plantation into the gloom of the jungle. When General Sasaki learned of the plight of the 229th Command Post, he ordered the 1st Battalion of the 13th Regiment to relieve Colonel Herard, and then return to the plantation to participate in the general attack. The 1st Battalion of the 13th stepped out, but what happened next is not known. The records of the 229th Regiment were destroyed with the Munda base there on New Georgia. It is not even known where the fighting was occurring at that moment, but it must have been in Colonel Liver's area, for on that day he claimed to have killed many Japanese, and General Hester's forces were making no progress early on the morning of July 11th. Colonel Leave's troops at Inagi began to advance again by 8 o'clock that morning. They had wiped out the small Japanese pockets, then they set about tidying up the Inagi camp as an American installation. At that point, Colonel Liversedge added up the results of his campaign. So far his Marines and soldiers had killed 350 Japanese. They had lost 47 men, killed 80 wounded and 4 missing, and they had captured 4 big 140 mm field guns, 3 anti-aircraft guns, and 18 machine guns, rifles, grenade launchers. 2 diesel tractors and a searchlight at Rabul Admiral Kusaka had the word of the loss of his Inagi base within a matter of minutes after the last troops moved out. The 11th Air Fleet sent an air mission against Inagi almost immediately on its capture at 10 o'clock that morning. Inagi was bombed, and again at 11:30 a.m. The Japanese came over, they did a little damage, knocked out some equipment and killed 3 Marines, and wounded 15 Livered had been worrying about his wounded, whose condition was not improving any in the field, and so it was a great relief when 3 PBC planes landed at 3 o'clock in the afternoon to take the wounded back to Guadalcanal. But the PB had scarcely landed than they were bombed and strafed by 2 Japanese float planes from the Shortlands base. Fortunately, the small arms fire from the shore drove the Japanese planes off without any damage, and the PB took off late that afternoon with all the wounded that night at 9 o'clock. 7 Higgins boats filled with supplies came up from Rice Anchorage. Inouye then was secure and supplied, and now Colonel Livered could turn all his thoughts to moving on against Munda back in the Zanana area. General Hester was still bogged down, and Japanese snipers were holding up his advance with remarkable skill. In order to shorten the supply route, General Hester decided to send the 172nd Regimental Combat Team to take Lana on the southeastern tip of the Munda Peninsula, very close to the defence perimeter of the Munda airfield garrison. General Sasaki moved his units around, and soon had the Zanana-Lana trail cut off as completely as was the Munda trail. In desperation, General Hester asked for naval artillery support, and Admiral Turner sent him a task force to bombard the enemy, but General Hester was not used to working with naval gunfire support, and he was afraid that the bombardment would hit among his own troops. Thus his designated targets were so far from his own lines that the naval bombardment force sent up under Admiral Merrill could do him little good. The Japanese simply moved forward close to the American lines, and the shells passed over their heads. Merrill brought 4 cruisers and 10 destroyers, and they made a Magnif ENT racket for 40 minutes. They fired 8,605 and 6 in shells, which was enough to stun a regiment, and they then turned and went away. The result was a lot of chopped-up jungle, but no Japanese casualties. The most serious effect of the bombardment on the Japanese was to keep them up late. But the same had to be said for the Americans of the 172nd Regimental Combat Team on the morning of July 12th. General Hester's men got moving against on the trail to Liana, but the Japanese harried them all day long. Then, before dark, the enemy also cut the trail behind the Americans, taking them out of contact with the 169th Infantry. Altogether, the move left the 172nd deep in the jungle without food or water, and with a quarter of a mile of muddy swamp between them and their objective, Liana Beach. On July 12th, Colonel Livard moved his forward headquarters to block the trail that led from Barocco. The landing point of Japanese troops fed over to New Georgia from Column Bangara, he had now accomplished his primary missions. Unfortunately, he was unaware of the two lesser trails that led from Barocco Harbour to join up with the Munda Barocco Trail below his block, but there was nothing more he could do at the moment. Enemy patrols were active around Inouye that day, probing for weakness. One patrol was driven off and 2 Japanese were killed. The next assault had to be on Mund, and Colonel Lived did not have the force to undertake such a mission. He had to wait for reinforcements. General Hester's force was to be just that, but those troops had not arrived, and it did not look as though they would in the near future. Meanwhile, the Japanese were doing very well with their limited resources, and they had managed to continue to resupply their troops using the trails unknown to the Americans. They began building up defences on the eastern shore of Barocco Harbour in preparation for the big assault on July 13th. Colonel Tominari joined up at the plantation camp. More of his troops had been brought across Column Bangara Island after they had been landed on the wrong side during the big naval battle of Kua Gulf. The troops had fed across the strait to Barocco and followed the path carved out by the advanced troops General Sasaki was getting ready to move. Finally, the Japanese command back at Rabaul was taking the problem of New Georgia seriously. Early on the morning of July 12th, a large force set sail from Rabaul for Column Bangara. It was led by Rear Admiral Shunji Isakin, the cruiser Jinsu, with some destroyers of Destroyer Squadron to Yukikazu, Hamakaze, Yugur, and Kon Army. They were escorting the destroyer transports Matsukaze, Satsuki, Minazuki, and Unagi, which were carrying the 1,300 troops of the 13th Regiment destined for the New Georgia battle. The Ali coast watchers saw the Japanese ships moving and sent the word post-haste to Admiral Holly, who ordered Admiral Answorth to go up the slot that night and intercept the enemy force for this mission. Holly gave Answorth additional destroyers, so that he left Guadalcanal with 10 plus the cruisers Honolulu Leander of the Royal New Zealand Navy, and St. Louis the Americans moved toward Column Bangara. With the confidence of radar-equipped fighters, the Japanese moved south with the confidence of experienced night fighters, but the Americans had the advantage of night fighters of another sort in the air just after midnight. One of the Black Cats announced the approach from the north of a cruiser, and 5 destroyers about 25 miles away. This was Admiral Isak's escort force, and the Americans intended to attack by radar, fully expecting to be able to do so before the Japanese discovered them. However, the Japanese had already discovered the Americans, as Admiral Ainsworth's ship swung into a single battle column, with 5 destroyers ahead and 5 destroyers behind the 3 cruisers. No, the Japanese did not have high-quality radar, but they did have electronic equipment to detect radar and to plot its emanations. Thus, Admiral Isaki knew the position and movements of the Americans for 2 hours before they arrived at 1 o'clock on the morning of July 13th. The American radar picked up the Japanese flotilla one big blip, and 5 little ones. Admiral Answorth ordered the ships to speed up while turning to the right to put the Japanese ships on the starboard beam. Thus, all the American warships would have a crack at the enemy. One of the problems of the Kula Gulf engagement had been the failure of the destroyers to use their torpedoes. That would not be the case this time. Just before 1:10 p.m., Admiral Answorth ordered the destroyers to start firing torpedoes at the blips on the radar. At the moment that the American ships became visible in the moonlight, at about 8 minutes 1 in the morning, Admiral Isaki ordered the destroyers to begin firing torpedoes. They did, and the long lances were on their way toward the American column secure in his radar. Admiral Answorth came on for another few moments, then unleashed the 6-in guns of the cruisers. As usual, All three American cruisers began firing on the biggest blip on the radar screens, the light cruiser Jinsu. In less than 10 minutes they fired 600 shells at her, perhaps 20 of them struck home, and they did the job. The Jinsu lost her steering, and then her fire rooms were hit and flooded, and she went dead in the water. At about this point she was struck by 2 of the American torpedoes, and she broke in half. The 2 halves of the ship drifted apart, both burning. She had been able only to fire a few salvos at the Allied ships before she sank, taking down the admiral and nearly all the crew of 480 men. One of those salvos had been aimed at the New Zealand cruiser Leander, and 1 shell at least hit her, knocking out her radio aerial that was not very. Serious damage to accept for the sinking of an enemy cruiser, but Admiral Answorth had underestimated his enemy. Those early torpedoes came on. The Admiral belatedly ordered a turn to the south. In making the turn, the Leander caught a torpedo which put her out of the battle. So Admiral Answorth detached the destroyers Radford and Jenkins to stand by the Leander and protect her from further attack. And at this point the Japanese cruiser Jinsu was sinking. 4 of the support force destroyers turned immediately after firing their torpedoes and retreated for a reload. The Mikazuki stood by the stricken flagship for a few minutes, then saw her danger and the impossibility of being much help to those 2 flaming PEs that had so recently been joined in one ship. She too turned and scudded north to reload. Above the battle, the pilot of a Black Cat KN fighter watched and reported to Admiral Answorth that the Japanese were retreating north at high speed. If that was not quite the case, still Admiral Answorth had to believe what the pilot saw. He also believed the reports from his ships, which claimed to have hit 6 separate vessels and left them all burning as the night wore on. He began to revise these figures downward, but he was still of the opinion that the battle was over, and all that remained to be done was to mop up the destroyers. Nicholas Owenon and Taylor were sent off northward, told to chase the enemy as far as the Shortlands if necessary, and sink them if they could. But they did not get the whole message, and although they moved out, they soon turned and headed back down the slot in the belief that Admiral Answorth had retired for the night. They were out of the battle. The enemy, in fact, was not retreating toward the Shortlands. Rather, Captain Yoshima Shimi had led the ships into a squall not far to the north, where they slowed and completed their torpedo reload in just a little over 15 minutes. Then they turned and came down at high speed to seek out the Americans again. Meanwhile, the 4 troop-carrying destroyers had moved in close to the column. Bangara Coast turned around the island and were now discharging the 1,300 troops of the 13th Regiment at Sandfly Harbour on the far coast. Although Admiral Isaki had gone down with his ship, his mission was already a success. Now Captain Shimai set out to make it more so. There were no blips on the American radar, but Admiral Answorth had those reports of burning enemy ships, and he turned north again to find them just before 2 o'clock in the morning. The radar of the flagship Honolulu picked up blips a little over 12 mil away. What ships were? Were they the destroyers he had sent north, and were they the enemy? There seemed to be only one way to find out. Worth began calling up all his destroyers to discover their whereabouts. Meanwhile, Captain Shimai was moving his destroyers south at high speed, prepared to attack as soon as he could make out the enemy. 5 minutes later, Captain Shimai saw the American force and ordered the torpedo attack. Earlier that night, the American fleet had turned sharply to the right to begin firing. The captain guessed that they would do so again, and ordered the torpedoes sent a little off to the right of the oncoming line of vessel. The Japanese destroyers fired, their torpedoes swung around and raced away. Just at this point, Admiral Answorth had completed his roll call and decided that the ships on the radar screen had to be the enemy. He ordered the cruisers to open fire, and once again to make a sharp right turn to be sure they all had good firing position. The sharp right turn took the American force squarely across the tracks of the Japanese torpedoes. A lookout aboard the Honolulu saw the first one passed by and shouted out the word, but by that time another torpedo had smashed into the St. Louis, and the Honolulu took the third in the bow, then a dud in the stern. The stem torpedo made a hole, but the bow torpedo spread the Honolulu's forepart out like a shark's mouth as the damage control parties ran to their work. The bridge of the Honolulu was exposed to a dreadful sight. Another torpedo smashed into the destroyer Gwyn just ahead of the Honolulu with a roar and a blinding flash. The Gwyn blew up in the middle. The crew tried to save her, but there was no saving this night. As dawn began to appear, the destroyer Ralph Talbot stood by to take off survivors, all but 2 officers and 59 men, and in the bright morning light she was scuttled. Admiral Answorth retired to the base at Tagi. He had sent ahead the word that he had scored an enormous victory, which had been true before he went back into the fight to go after the Japanese destroyers. By the time he got to Tulagi, he was thoroughly depressed by the extent of his losses and damages, but at the base the cruiser men were greeted as conquerors by a brass band, and all sorts of congratulations. Ainsworth's self-esteem was also raised when the Americans rescued one of the handful of survivors of the Jintsu, and he swore up and down that the Americans had sunk most of the Isaki force. It was not true, of course, but in a way the Americans had scored a victory, even in defeat. They could afford to have 3 cruisers damaged one so badly. That it was out of the rest of the war, they could even afford to lose a destroyer. The American production machine at home could absorb this easily enough, and for every ship sunk 3 came along. There was no brass band to greet Captain Shimai when he returned to Rabaul, and there was not even much talk of victory. That was not the Japanese way. But the feeling that a victory had been won ran high, and the Japanese, too, exaggerated the extent of the American losses, claiming all 3 cruisers sunk plus several, not 1 destroyers. The press at home in Japan trumpeted as usual, and within the Japanese naval establishment the memory of Admiral Isaki was criticized because he repeated a mistake that the Japanese believed had already cost the Japanese the battleship Hei at the start of the battle to confuse the enemy. He had turned on his searchlight. But instead of confusing the Americans, the searchlight said his detractors had given them an aiming point. That claim was not really true. The Americans were firing by radar and not by visual observation. The Japanese criticism of their commander showed a basic misunderstanding and underestimation of the enemy's capability, just as the continued American carelessness about Japanese torpedoes showed an American failure. Writing shortly after the war, Samuel Eliot Morison expressed wonder that the American Navy had not, by the summer of 1943, come to grips with the nature of the Japanese torpedoes. No one in authority in the South Pacific seemed to understand what the Japanese had, although since the beginning of the Tokyo Express runs down the slot, the Japanese had scored victory after victory. By using these torpedoes, Admiral Answorth went into the Battle of Kolombangara, believing that the destroyer Strong sunk only a few days earlier had been the victim of a submerged submarine, not of a destroyer torpedo fired from a distance, impossible for an American destroyer to duplicate. Some officers had heard rumors about the effectiveness of the Japanese torpedoes, but they were just that rumors. Commanders did not make policy based on rumors, and there were no official directives, nor any high-level understanding of the problem. This was true, even though Morison reported a long lance torpedo came ashore at Cape Esperance on Guadalcanal, was taken apart and examined, and the facts were sent on to Pacific Fleet Intelligence at Pearl Harbor. There the report was apparently bottled up, one of the vital bits of information of the day, and the war went on. The fact was that the Japanese at Kumbangara had again outfought the Americans and defeated them. In terms of damage done, but it was also a pick victory. The loss of the cruiser Gintsu was a high price to pay for a Japanese navy that was already feeling the results of the long battle of attrition in the Solomons. From the Japanese army point of view, the Battle of Kolombangara had been a complete success. The Navy's protective force had done just what it set out to do, drawn the American attack away from the troop landing, and 1,300 badly needed reinforcements were on their way to New Georgia. But once again the Japanese army made a vital mistake. It brought too little power forward to do the job. For example, just then Admiral Turner was pressing Admiral High for about 25,000 more troops to throw into the battle. The Japanese were thinking in terms of battalions, the Americans in terms of divisions later in the war. The troop shortage would plague the Japanese just at this time. That difficulty was not paramount. The Japanese could have sent the whole 6th Division to reinforce General Sasaki, and the idea was suggested at Rabaul by junior staff officers. However, the commanders looked to New Guinea and worried about their two-front war. They made the mistake of ignoring the suggestion that strong manpower at this juncture would do wonders in the defense of New Georgia. In the air, Japanese and American planes fought nearly every day as the American Solomons Air Force met the Japanese 11th Air Fleet. The Japanese sent flights of bombers and occasional single planes, and in the evenings the seaplanes from the Shortlands were out cooler. Gulf was the scene of activity on both sides, night after night. The difference between the war at this stage and that of a few months earlier at Guadalcanal was that Cooler Gulf, unlike Iron Bottom Sound, was a real no-man's land. Japanese and Americans moved in those waters constantly by night, and there were many minor encounters in which men died. Scores of planes were lost on both sides as the pilots bombed and strafed the waters of the Gulf, for example, on July 14th. A whole flight of 4 P-39-era Cobras simply disappeared over southern New Georgia. Whether they fell afoul of a flight of Zeros or ran into bad weather was a matter for intelligence to try to figure out. Those 4 pilots were just statistics in a war so hot that only the major actions have been chronicled. At Inaji, Colonel Livard was bogged down. He had taken this point as directed, but he could not move until someone else did. The victory of the naval forces at Kolombangara did not seem like much of a victory since all this, while the enemy was continuing to infiltrate more troops.